10 Terrible Days by an anonymous contributor to All the Year Round magazine, March 26, 1864. Recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Terrible Days. In the year 1861, about 30 vessels laden with wheat were consigned to England from California. In that wonderfully luxuriant country the harvest had been more plentiful than usual, and merchants were adventuring it in shiploads to all parts of the world. I, a woman, who am about to tell the true, unvarnished tale of the most terrible 10 days of her life, was going to England at that time with my only child, a little girl of 4 years old, and being in delicate health, a long sea voyage in a sailing vessel was thought better for me than a berth in one of the ill-ventilated and overcrowded steamers then and still running between San Francisco and New York via Panama. Thus I became a passenger for Liverpool in the David Brown, a large American clipper, distinguished for size, cleanliness, and the excellence of its passenger accommodation. The only fellow passengers to whom I need allude were a lady from British Columbia, whom I will call Mrs. F., wife of a major in the British Army. She had with her 2 children and a female servant. I had known this lady previously in Vancouver Island. We were friends, therefore, at once. On the 11th of October, '61, the beautiful vessel, laden with her 2,000 tons of grain, slowly and gracefully sailed out of the noble bay of San Francisco. Dear friends were standing on the wharf, the bitter partings were over, the sun was shining as it always does in California, until the sea and the rocks and the vast city seemed literally glittering with sunlight. One long look back to the happy home of the last 6 years, to the home still of husband and brothers obliged to remain behind, and at last I had only the sea that parted us to look at through my tears. Our friends had seen us set sail in what seemed a gallant ship. It had been chosen from all others as the one to send us home in for its show of perfectness. There were men in San Francisco who knew that the ship was unseaworthy, having been frightfully strained in her last voyage to China, and that she was in no fit condition to be trusted with the lives of helpless women and children. Yet they let us sail without a word of warning. Poor Mrs. F. and myself had not been 2 days at sea before we found out what a frightful mistake had been made in the choice of a sailing vessel as our home for the next 3 months. We were so miserable that at last, like 2 schoolgirls, we kept a list of all the days on a slip of paper, notching them off at night with glee because another day was over. When we had been a week at sea, the ship was hove to one day. There was a small leak which the carpenter tried to repair, but, I suppose, ineffectually. The captain made light of it, and we had no fear, never thinking it probable that this small leak was a warning of the utmost peril. Often the vessel was stopped for the same small leak, but if we made inquiry, we were told there was no cause for fear, and did not fear. For except these short pauses, the ship sailed gallantly on, we had lovely weather, and the captain really thought to make quick and profitable passage. We rounded Cape Horn on a lovely summer day, our winter being its summer, and the little Cape pigeons were flying around us continually, to the great delight of the children. About this time the second officer caught an albatross for the amusement of the ladies and children, but the untimely fate of the Ancient Mariner having taken strong hold on the captain's imagination, the bird was immediately thrown into the sea, and the officer got a severe rebuke for his temerity. We passed along the coast of Brazil, and were so near Pernambuco that we could see the lights in the houses and hear music from shore, and then the captain said that the next land we should see would be the long low shores of Ireland. On the night of the 4th of January, '62, we had been 86 days out, and in 10 more we thought to be in England. Our little ones were fast asleep in bed, and we had been on deck for a few moments watching the stir of angry waters, for the heavens looked dark and threatening, and the sailors prophesied a stormy night. We had not been below in the saloon for many minutes when there was a little son born to one of the passengers. We all did what we could for the poor mother, but there was no doctor on board, and as all the other children awoke with the unusual noise and bustle, we were nearly deafened with their screaming. The wind, too, increased in fury, and the ship rolled till we could not stand. Half frightened at the roaring of the waters, and deeply impressed with the new responsibility of having this poor sick woman and her helpless baby to take care of, we went reluctantly to bed. My own little one had again fallen asleep, and, after gazing at her long and earnestly, with some vague unacknowledged fear, I at last fell into an uneasy, restless slumber. I remember waking once, and seeing the captain quickly pass, with his charts in his hand, when Anita said, "Oh, mamma, what noise is that?" True enough, the noise on deck was awful, for the wind and the waves seemed lashing the ship to madness. But the child fell asleep again, and I lay half asleep, when suddenly I heard a voice calling my name in quick, sharp tones. Starting up wildly, I saw at my cabin door the trembling figure of Mrs. F., her face white with fear, her eyes distended with horror. My own teeth chattering with fright, I asked her what was the matter. "Oh, we are going down," she said. "The ship is sinking." Husband, mother, brothers, sisters came to my thought in that instant with a fearful agony of yearning. My child, my only one, was asleep beside me. Wildly I stooped and kissed her, for I thought at that first moment there was no hope, and that foundered at sea we were going down rapidly. The child slept on, and I hushed my breath to listen. Stand I could not, for the ship was rolling frightfully, and every few moments a great wave would dash with remorseless force against her sides, making her shake and quiver again. Mrs. F. had gone with her two little ones into the captain's cabin. Awaking my child, I hastily dressed her and myself in the first bits of clothing I could find, and joined my friend. The small leak had at last burst into a large one, and the ship was filling rapidly. We remained till dawn shivering and shaking below, for by keeping the 3 pumps at work and lightening the vessel of her heavy cargo, the captain meant to save her if he could. At dawn, taking my little girl by the hand, I went on deck. The storm had in some measure abated, but the sea looked black and sullen, and the swell of the vast heavy waves seemed to mock our frailty. The sailors had been up all night, and were as men playing at some ferocious game, some working in desperation at the pumps, and singing at the pitch of their voices wild sea songs to time their common efforts. Others employed in throwing hundreds of bags of grain into the sea. They might thus lighten the ship. This, I think, more than all, showed me our peril. I wandered about, too miserable to remain in any one spot, till the captain assembled us all once more in the cabin to get some food, saying that it was impossible to save the ship, and that we should have need of all our fortitude. I remember my own vain attempt to eat some bread, but the poor little children took their breakfast and enjoyed it. We were then each provided with a large bag made of sailcloth, and were advised by the captain to fill it with the warmest articles of clothing we possessed. All my worldly possessions were on board, comprising many memorials of dear friends, portraits of loved ones I shall never see again, and my money loss I knew would be no trifle. In perfect bewilderment I looked around, and filled my bag with stockings and a couple of warm shawls. On the top of a box I saw a little parcel that had been entrusted to me by a lady in California to deliver to her mother in Liverpool. I put that in my bag, and she got it. I then dressed myself and the child in as many things as we could possibly bear, for I thought of the cold, drenching nights, and shuddered when I looked at that only little one on whom rough winds had never been allowed to blow, the idol of her parents' hearts, so fair and delicate, who must now venture out in a frail boat on the wide stormy sea. I uttered a wild prayer to God for her, full of sobs and anguish, with tears that don't come often in a lifetime, and then there followed a dead calm, in which I saw every minute detail of the scene about me. There had been no thought of removing the breakfast, and with the rolling of the ship, which was every moment becoming worse, everything had fallen on the floor and was dashing about in all directions. Boxes, water jugs, plates, dishes, chairs, glasses, were pitching from one end of the saloon to the other. Children screaming, sailors shouting and cursing, and loud above all there was the creaking of timbers and the sullen sound of water fast gaining upon us in the hold of the ship, which groaned and labored like a living thing in agony. Poor Mrs. F. was in a terrible strait at this moment. Her little boy was discovered helping himself out of the medicine chest, particularly busy with the contents of a broken calomel bottle. How pale she looked with her poor little baby in her arms. If I remember aright, we made the boy drink some lamp oil as an emetic. At any rate, he survived the calomel. And now the first mate, upon whose decision and firmness much depended, having lost his presence of mind, had drunk deeply of whiskey. He was intoxicated, and so too were many of the sailors who had followed his example. What was to become of us with a fast sinking ship and a parcel of drunken men for our protectors? The captain had been busily employed in ordering out food and water to supply the boats, collecting his ship's papers, examining his charts, etc. The lowering of the boats he had entrusted to his officers. On hearing of the drunkenness on deck, his first thought was to get the women and children off at once, for should the sailors seize the boats, what would become of us? 2 boats had already been smashed whilst lowering them into the sea, and there were only 2 remaining. 47 people to cram into 2 frail boats, 1,500 miles from land. Delicately nurtured women, helpless children, drunken and desperate men. The captain and the second officer, a Scotchman from Greenock, behaved admirably at this time. By the help of the most sober of the sailors, the captain's own boat was lowered, some small mattresses, pillows, blankets, a cask of water, sacks of biscuits, and nautical instruments necessary for the captain's use, were first put in. Then we were let down by ropes. It seems marvelous, when I think of it now, that in our descent we were not dashed to pieces against the ship's side. We had to wait, for each descent, a favorable moment whilst she was leaning over. Then the word of command was given, and we were slung down like sheep. My heart stood still whilst my little one was going down, and then I followed. It was a terrible sight for a woman to see that poor creature whose baby was born the night before, looking like a corpse in a long dressing gown of white flannel, with the poor little atom of mortality tightly clasped in her arms. I thought she would die before the day was over. At last we were all in the boat, 4 women, 5 children, the second mate, and 16 sailors. The captain stayed on the ship, providing for the safety of the drunken creatures who could not take care of themselves, and then he joined us. How small our boat looked by the side of that large ship, and we had to get quickly out of her reach, for she was rolling so heavily that the waters near her boiled up like a maelstrom. The chief officer, 3 passengers, and the remaining sailors were still on board the David Brown when we left her. I suppose they were soon in their boat, for they overtook us some hours after. It was no light trial to look at that once beautiful ship, left to her fate in the stormy sea, with all my little treasures in her for the waters to close over. Yet still, how little was the worth to me of everything she contained in comparison with my child, and dark as the future looked, yet she was with me, so far safe and well. Away we drifted, a mere speck upon the ocean. Before night there came a storm of thunder, lightning, wind, and rain, that lasted through the darkness, and by which we were drenched through and through. I sat up for some 12 or 14 hours on a narrow plank, with my child in my arms, utterly miserable, cold and hopeless, soaked to the skin, blinded by the salt spray, my face and hands smarting intolerably with the unusual exposure. When daylight came we all looked wan and lost. There was a faint light in the distance, which we hoped might be a ship's light, but it proved to be on board the other boat with its now sobered crew. For 3 days we kept in sight of each other, but the third day we parted company and saw them no more. During the storm and confusion, the greater part of our biscuits had been soaked with salt water and made useless. It was also discovered that the food collected for the captain's boat had been thrown by mistake into the other, therefore it was necessary at once to put us on allowance, half a pint of water and half a biscuit a day to each person. Except the biscuit, there were only a few small tins of preserved strawberries and Indian corn, and these were given to the ladies. How the poor children cried with hunger as the days dragged on! Think what it must have been to the mothers to hear children delicately nurtured sobbing ravenously for a piece of bread or a drink of water, craving for it all day, falling asleep whilst asking for it, awakening in the night with the same heart-rending cry, and the broken-hearted mothers utterly powerless to satisfy them. I felt desperate, mad at that time. I would have flung myself thankfully into the waves if by doing so I could have procured bread for my child. For the first 2 or 3 days we were full of hope that we should meet a ship, and consoled each other by laboring to make light of our difficulties. Yet had it not been that we were shipwrecked in warm latitudes, we could not have saved our lives. The boat leaked from the beginning, and the sailors by turns bailed the water out in little cans. Thus we were continually lying or sitting in salt water. The part of the boat set apart for the women and children was amidships, and about 7 feet square. There we always remained, huddled together from sunset to sunrise, when we had to leave our places and in the daytime stow ourselves anywhere to give the men room for their rowing. Exposed to the glare of a tropical sun for hours together, nearly mad with thirst, bearing my child in my weak arms, for she was too much exhausted to stand, there was a feeling of burning, sickening heat on my brain, and the horrid disgust for everybody and everything around me was almost more than I could endure. I never shed any tears. Often I would sit for hours, without any thought at all, vacantly gazing on the ocean. We had 3 days of dead calm. The sun glared down upon us piteously, and I thought how pleasant it would be to throw myself into the sea and sink calmly to death beneath its waves. I lost all wish to live, for life seemed horrible. I cannot describe the days as they passed, separately, one by one. When I look upon them, they all seem to have been one misery. I remember that on the 3rd day out, poor Kitty's baby died. Indeed, it had been dying from the first. It never had a chance of living, for it had no fit attention and no sustenance. The poor mother cried bitterly when at last it became cold on her bosom, but its death was a merciful release. Wrapped in a shawl of bright colors, it was thrown overboard, but was so light that it could not sink, and floated for hours on a sea so calm in the hot sun that scarce a ripple could be seen. At last it disappeared suddenly, the prey of some hungry shark, and when afterwards the horrid monsters crowded round our boat, they added to our misery. Hitherto the children had been plunged into the sea every morning to preserve them in health, but we dared not continue this practice with those horrid creatures on our lee. Every evening before the sun went down, a sailor was sent to the top of the mast to look out, but every evening he reported no vessel in sight, and again the sun set on us without hope. Then we had nights of drenching, pitiless rain, for we were now in the region where squalls come up with great fury, the sky suddenly becomes dark, and a quick sharp wind arises, herald of a rainstorm. When traveling by the steamers in these latitudes, the captain calls out, "There's a squall coming, ladies better go below," upon which there is a great rushing and collecting of books and shawls, and in a few moments the decks are deserted, while the passengers, peeping out of the windows, rather enjoy the little excitement. Very different was our case, for we could only watch the storm gathering in the distance, and know that we had to lie there, to be drenched through, and to dry again under the blazing sun 6 times in a day, and at night have the same trouble, only aggravated by the darkness. From this cause, and the incessant contact with salt water which continually leaked into the boat, the delicate skin of the women and children became frightfully irritated, and in total absence of fresh water, this irritation produced sores. Ah me! What a horrid thing it was to be literally surrounded by water, soaked through with it, our eyes aching with the sight of it, and yet longing with unutterable agony for a draught of it to quench our burning thirst, or to wash our smarting, blistering skin. One night when it was raining heavily, I tried the experiment of lying down with my mouth open to catch a few stray drops, but a huge wave came dashing along and burst full upon us, pouring down my throat and almost choking me. It was cruelly salty and nauseous. I would sometimes fall asleep from pure exhaustion, only to wake with a shuddering start at feeling something on my face. I would put up my hands in a fright and find my face covered with dirty wet feet of a sleeping sailor. Then I would push them away with my small amount of strength, but that made no impression. Then I would say, "Oh, please take your feet away," and a heavy snore or a curse would be the only answer. The frightful amount of cursing and swearing common among the sailors at a time when every day seemed likely to be our last filled me with horror and amazement. I must not forget one incident, trifling in itself, but which might have caused the death of one of the sailors. On the day of the wreck I had caused 2 or 3 bottles of ale and one of claret to be put in the boat, thinking it might be of great use to us. On the 3rd or 4th night out, when we were shivering helplessly after a drenching shower of rain, we thought that a bottle of ale should be opened for the women and children, but not a bottle of any sort was to be found. The rage of the captain was awful. "Who amongst the sailors," cried he, "could be so base, so cruel, as to drink the ale belonging to one of the ladies, and put on board expressly for the suffering women?" For some time the thief could not be discovered, but at last one of the men told who was the delinquent, and then the captain, in his wrath, said that the man who could be guilty of such meanness at such a time was worthy of death, and should be thrown overboard. And the decree would certainly have been executed had not Mrs. F. and myself implored the captain to spare the man's life. After many prayers on our part, he consented. I do not know whether the man was grateful or not, certainly he never said he was. I mention this incident to show how men take the law into their own hands at a time of great and common peril. Every day now increased our suffering. The hunger of the children was frightful, and when the water was served out, they would fight for it with their little hands, and often upset it entirely in the eager haste to possess it. As the days dragged along, the men looked almost wolfish in their hunger and desperation, and they were hard worked too, for they had to row night and day alternately. Some of their faces entirely lost their natural expression, becoming wild with hunger and thirst, and then a fearful talk arose among some of the crew that they might eat the children. But the captain was warned of their plot, and there were brave men among the sailors who had pity for us. It was on the morning of the 10th day that this frightful thought came into the heads of 3 or 4 desperate men, and the captain and a few trustworthy companions had made up their minds to slay the would-be murderers that very night in their sleep. The last and fatal hour of our great agony seemed to be come. But there was pity in heaven. The evening before, when the sun set in glorious tropical splendor, I kissed my child in despair because another day had gone and had brought no relief, when she said, "Mamma, I will pray to God." The little one was only 4 years old, a blue-eyed, golden-haired creature with a wondrously fair complexion and innocent face, and the contrast of this pretty tiling kneeling in the desolate boat with the wild, haggard-looking men and women who surrounded her was almost startling. Her prayer was very simple. With clasped hands and trustful eyes raised to heaven, she said, "Please God, send a ship." That was all. The hot tears gushed to my eyes for the first time in that boat, and I took her in my almost powerless arms, and we both slept the sleep of exhaustion. On the morning of the 10th day, about 11 o'clock, someone called out, "A sail! A sail! Wonderful sound! How we started, almost upsetting the boat in our eagerness to see where it was and what it was. The next question was, how could we make her see us? We could see her, it is true, a faint speck on the horizon, but we were so small, such a pitiful little boat, and had no flags, no signals of distress. What if she were to pass us? Frightful thought, to be so near help and yet not to reach it. We hoisted a white towel and shouted, and tried every means in our power to attract attention. On she came, nearer and nearer, until we could make out that she was a bark. The captain could even distinguish that she carried the Hamburg flag. Why she had her flag hoisted, if she did not see us, I cannot say. Never mind who or what she was. She passed along and left us. Then curses, loud and deep, came from the sailors' lips. Then the women looked into each other's faces, and the children cried, and the wolfish eyes of the would-be cannibals were fixed upon us, and I sat still for hours without a word. Forsaken apparently by God and man, I was trying, with the stupor of despair, and I think coming delirium, to meet my fate, and some songs that I used to sing in San Francisco came into my head. The notes would not come right, and I wondered whether such a note was G sharp or A flat, and the sea looked red and full of specks. It was a burning hot day, and I was half asleep about 3 p.m., when again was heard the cry of "A sail! A sail!" This time I made a very feeble attempt to look about me, but the captain and his crew were all alert, and a vessel surely was in sight. On she came, looking so large to our forlorn eyes. Again our towel was hoisted. Would she pass us? "Let the women and children lie down in the bottom of the boat," roared the captain. "If she sees so many people, she will pass us like that cursed thing this morning." Down we went, breathless. Nearer and nearer she came. Faster rowed our hungry sailors, and there rose a wild shout, "She has stopped!" And surely there she was at rest in the waters, waiting to see what manner of beings we were. "Row faster, my men, and keep down the women and children." Ah! Did he think that the sight of us poor women would frighten away that ship? And then the sweet voice of my little one said, "Oh, mamma, God has heard my prayer, and he has sent a ship to save us." Oh, what a lovely afternoon that was when we were saved! Such a blaze of sunshine, such blue skies, such a glistening, glowing sea, as if even the treacherous ocean were rejoicing with us. At length we were close alongside of the ship, and saw crowds of human beings clustering about to look at us. Dark, swarthy faces, for they were all Spaniards, but full of pity, wonderment, and horror. They took us all in, one by one, and when they saw the women and little children they wept. They could not speak our language, and looked upon us with bewilderment. But when I, who fortunately could speak Spanish, kneeling down on deck, said gracias a Dios, thank God, their tongues were loosened, and there was a flood of questions and crowding round us, with weeping and laughing and shaking of hands. How good were those kind-hearted men! How I thank them all, every one, now, as I write, from the worthy captain down to the lowest of his crew. And they brought us bread and wine and water, precious water. How good it was! Saved at last, when we could have endured no more, let it at least be permitted to a mother to believe that the prayer of her little one had risen to the mercy seat. End of 10 Terrible Days, by an anonymous contributor to All the Year Round magazine, March 26, 1864.